Hello, and welcome to Steps Together, the Steps for Development podcast, where we come together to grow our own skills and learn how to help children thrive and succeed. I'm your host, Deb Johnson, and I'm really glad you're here. Today, I want to dive into behaviors. Now, behaviors is a really big topic, and I know that I'm going to do plenty of other episodes that dive into specific behaviors, specific challenges, talk about strategies that are good for specific situations. But today, I want to offer what I call a behavior primer, an overview of how we typically look at behavior, um, outline a better way to view and understand behavior, and then summarize the approach that I have found to be really successful at creating lasting change in behaviors, relationships, and growth for both the children and adults. So let's just dive right in by talking about how behavior is typically viewed. In our current world, we often view behavior in a very simplistic manner. We see it very much as cause and effect, right? And really, that's all behavior is. It's a response to a stimulus. Now, behaviorist approaches, I think, in my opinion, tend to oversimplify behavior. We all like quick answers, easy solutions. So when a child is doing something that is really difficult, a really challenging thing, like maybe they're being physically aggressive or they're breaking things, they're saying very harmful, hurtful things to others. Parents sometimes say they're disrespecting authority, they're not following directions, things that are really disruptive to daily life. We all want a quick solution. We want to stop that behavior, right? We want that tantrum to just stop. We want the crying, the screaming to just stop. So we tend to focus on controlling the behavior. And in order to do that, we focus on what is the child getting out of the behavior, right? We look at it as the child is doing this behavior for a specific reason, and it is to gain something on their part. Now, in terms of a behaviorist approach, we look at things like their attention seeking or avoiding a task, that type of thing. And the problem with that is that it doesn't look at the bigger picture, right? It doesn't look at the emotions and the perceptions and the context of the behavior. It just tries to simplify it to this child does this behavior because they want attention. So we're going to try not giving them attention. We're going to do what some people call it planned ignoring, and we're going to see if that doesn't extinguish the behavior. The problem is that doesn't always work. And the reality is that there's no one size fits all solution to behaviors. We really have to dive into and explore and get to know and understand what is lying underneath the behavior. What is really contributing to that? And because we as human beings are so unique and so dynamic as individuals, our nervous systems, our personalities, our experiences that shape us and shape our behaviors and our responses, those are all so unique and different. It's impossible to have a one size fits all solution. There isn't going to be any set of instructions, as much as we would like that set of instructions for our children. That just doesn't exist, where we can say, oh, when child A does this, then we respond this way, and 100% of the time, this works. It just doesn't work that way, at least certainly not in my experience. So what we need to consider are all the factors that are potentially underlying the behavior. And in my experience as an occupational therapist and a parent, I have found just a multitude of factors that are influencing behavioral responses. Honestly, not just of our children, but of all of us. So let me go through these. And I don't know if I'm going to get all of them. I don't know if this is an exclusive list. There may be things influencing behavior that I haven't added here, but these are some of the things that I typically think about when I'm trying to problem solve for a challenging behavior. So, in no particular order of importance, I'm going to start with skill deficits. This does tend to be a biggie. If we don't have the skills to do a task, if we don't have the strength, the motor coordination, the perceptual skills, the visual motor skills to put eyes and hands together, what we see with what our hands are doing, if we don't have the cognitive skills, right, the executive function skills for coping and response inhibition, if we don't have the sensory processing skills to be able to interpret the world around us in an efficient and adaptive way, we aren't going to behave in an adaptive way. So if I'm a young child, if I'm 7 or 8 years old, and I have motor problems that make it difficult for me to get dressed, I'm going to scream and cry and yell about getting dressed. Or maybe I'm going to be very demanding that I need help getting dressed, even though I'm 8 years old. And then we're going to end up with parent and child in a power struggle because expectations are that an 8-year-old can get dressed. But if they don't have the skills, they can't do it. Same thing with executive function skills. These are the skills of being able to inhibit our responses, being able to regulate our emotions, being able to plan and organize. Kids with ADHD, they have executive function skill problems. They can't plan and organize. So to expect a child with ADHD to go and independently clean their room, it's just not in alignment with what their skills are if they can't plan and organize and even initiate that task. So we have to recognize the importance of skill deficits or impairments, or we can call them skill challenges, right? Lagging skills. Ross Greene, author of Explosive Child and many other wonderful books, he refers to lagging skills, meaning these are skills that need to develop over time. And certain conditions, right, developmental disorders might impact how those skills are developing, and then that impacts the behavioral response when the child has demands placed on them. So that's a nice little segue to the next thing that absolutely influences behavioral responses, which are conditions or disorders that the child may have. And these might be neurodevelopmental disorders, things like autism, ADHD, learning disorders. It might mean medical conditions or mental health issues, things that are impacting their ability to cope effectively, to engage in certain skills at the expected level, where their developmental level is not the same as their chronological age. They don't match. And this causes a lot of dissonance, not only for the adults who are trying to guide the child and raise or work with the child, but it causes a lot of frustration internally for the child, especially if they have cognitive abilities that allow them to have some insight to the fact that all their friends are doing this. You know, their classmates can all tie their shoes, but they can't. And they maybe can't because of problems with visual perceptual skills related to a learning disorder or something to that effect. General health conditions can also impact behavior. Has your child had enough sleep? Do they get good nutrition? Do they have problems with digestion and elimination? A child who has chronic constipation, those kids are often very cranky and irritable. They're in pain and they might not indicate it. But that can absolutely affect how they behave at any given time. Another thing that absolutely impacts behavior is the idea of what are our expectations, whether that is culturally or contextually, right? How do we expect the child to behave in certain situations? This can vary from one setting to another. For example, a child who can't sit still doesn't really have a problem when they're outside at the park because that's where not sitting still and moving is appropriate. It's in the right context. But if you're trying to attend a religious service and your child can't sit still, now suddenly that's a challenging behavior. It's very problematic because they can't adapt and adjust to the context. The other piece of this is our own cultural expectations. This has to do with your ethnic background, your cultural, maybe your cultural religious cultures that you belong to or were raised in. Maybe it's your parenting culture that you were raised by authoritarian parents. And so you yourself parent from an authoritarian perspective. You have expectations. When I say jump, my child should say, how high? There should be this obedience. Sometimes that's a mismatch. Sometimes that's stressful for the child. If you have a family culture of high achievement and you have a child with ADHD or a learning disorder or autism or any other skill issues, skill challenges, then there is definitely going to be stress if the family culture is for high achievement. It just creates that pressure and the stress that absolutely influences behavior. Another aspect of sort of a condition would be personality differences. These greatly affect behavioral responses. So this might be whether your child is introverted or extroverted. It might mean that you have a shy child versus a very outgoing child. It might mean that you have a strong-willed child. All these kinds of temperaments or personality differences are going to contribute to different behaviors. And these personality differences can become very problematic if they're not in sync with the other adults around them. So if you have a strong-willed child who really questions authority and they are with a parent who practices from an authoritative perspective, so this parent is understanding of the child's needs and respectful of their differences and their challenges, and that adult doesn't become sort of defensive or intimidated by a child calling out their hypocrisy or correcting them or doing other strong-willed behaviors, then that might not be a challenging behavior. However, if they're in a different setting, this happens often in school, where children are very strong-willed and they're expressing their autonomy, and in that setting, bucking authority, right, is not acceptable. It's not what we want. And so for that child, now that becomes a very challenging behavior, but sometimes only in certain contexts and only with certain people. Another aspect of a condition or sort of the inherent personality characteristics is regarding gifted and twice exceptional children. This is an area very close to my heart. I have gifted twice exceptional children, and that really pushed me to understand this group of individuals better. And, you know, the gifted population is very unique and has inherent differences in terms of how they process information, how there's correlation in this population with how they process sensory information. They may very often have sensory challenges related specifically to tactile and auditory processing. Twice exceptional children are a whole unique subset. And so children who are gifted and also have autism, also have ADHD, also have executive function skill problems, processing issues, learning disorders, children who are gifted with dyslexia. These kinds of sort of paradoxical conditions create tremendous stress inside the child and for those who are raising them and working with them and trying to help them succeed, because there's just such a paradox in their abilities, right? They might do really, really well in one regard, right? Maybe they're very highly verbal and they read way above grade level, or they can do math way above grade level, but their social emotional skills are actually lagging behind. Or maybe they have a coexisting motor coordination problem. And so then they get frustrated because they have really big ideas and they want to follow their siblings or their peers, but they just don't have the skills to do that. And that creates a tremendous amount of anxiety and stress, which absolutely influences behavioral responses. Another piece of complexity with behaviors has to do with just how our nervous system responds and regulates itself. So people who have sensory challenges often have problems with what we call an OT modulation, sensory modulation, emotional modulation. Our sensory experiences and our emotional responses are very closely linked in a system within our brain called the limbic system. And we'll dive deeper into limbic system responses in another podcast. But today, I just want you to understand that having over responsivity or hypersensitivities to sensory information can be very problematic. At the same time, being under responsive and not noticing sensory input can be problematic, right? So kids that are over responsive may have trouble habituating to everyday sounds. And so they're always escalating when the school bell rings or the alarm sounds, on a timer. Kids who are under responsive may not notice when you call their name and they don't respond until you scream at them the fourth time. And then you get this huge out of proportion response. Although to them, it seems in proportion because the first time they heard you was when you screamed at them. They don't understand why you're screaming because they honestly didn't hear you when you called their name the 3 times before that. Closely related to that in terms of sensory processing and limbic system responses and a dysregulated nervous system would be a general trauma history. Now, trauma has been really expanded lately. I've done a lot of looking into trauma-informed care and understanding trauma responses in the last, I'd say, 5 years. And we really practice at Steps for Kids. We practice from a trauma-informed approach. And I look at behavior through a trauma lens because trauma now, we understand, can be small, insidious little things that happen over and over and over again. Or they can be one big event that has a significant impact on us. And it doesn't really matter what the event was. What matters is our response, which is what Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, he calls the response the trauma, right? The event wasn't really the trauma. The trauma is the continued limbic system response where we live in this constant state of fight or flight. Or maybe we have these triggers that push us into fight or flight quickly because of past events that our body and our brain have interpreted as threats, lack of safety, that type of thing. So those are those trauma responses. And very often our behaviors, our children's behaviors and our behaviors as adults are driven by those trauma responses. Another piece related to our nervous system are just mental health concerns. You may have a diagnosed or undiagnosed condition of anxiety or depression or any other mental health disorder that is correlated with a dysregulated nervous system, that we don't regulate our emotional responses well, that we struggle, right? And very often there's a combination of experience and sort of neurological, biochemical, genetic, hereditary types of things that are going on there. And even could be related to things like sleep and nutrition that exacerbate anxiety or depressed moods and mood swings, explosive moods, anger issues, those types of things. So if we don't acknowledge that children have these issues, just like all of us as adults do, then we're really missing out on the complexities of the underlying issues that are affecting and driving the behavioral responses that we're trying to address. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of factors are what we often refer to as learned behaviors. I get this a lot where adults will say, it's just a learned behavior. Well, I want to share a little secret with you. It's pretty much all learned behavior. The only thing in our human existence that is not a learned behavior are our reflexes, right? Our gag reflex, our pain reflex, our equilibrium and righting responses, the inner ear organ, our vestibular system that helps us to, suddenly put our arms out and catch ourselves. Those are the reflexes. We don't have to learn those things. Those are just there. Everything else we've learned. It might be that our nervous system learned how to respond. It learned how to not notice certain things or how to be super sensitive to certain things. And it could be conditioned responses where we've learned just from repetition and association that these things go together for good or for bad. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's negative. But this is the way that we learn how to behave. We take information in, whether that is cognitive, intellectual information, sensory information, all our experiences, however they come in, and our brain processes all this information, somehow, by some miracle, creates perceptions that translate to emotions and that get linked together with our experiences. This is why we have things that we call triggers, right? So I'm going to give you a kind of a basic example of a conditioned response. If you grew up in a home where somebody baked all the time, there was always the smell of baked goods. And in that home, you felt loved and nurtured. You were always greeted warmly and praised, and you just felt good. When you are grown as an adult, you are probably going to be in your happy place when you're at a bakery because your brain has been conditioned. It's a learned response to associate the warmth of the bakery, the smells of the bakery, with those warm, fuzzy feelings that you had as a kid. But if we flip that script and we imagine a home where somebody always bakes and you are always smelling cookies and breads and wonderful things coming out of the oven, but it was a dysfunctional family where you were hurt verbally, maybe physically, right? There were harmful things, traumatizing events. That starts to create a limbic system response in your brain. And your brain can then correlate those bakery smells with horrible experiences. So now, as an adult, you might walk into a bakery and have a panic attack. So these are learned behaviors, right? And then at its highest level, or at the highest level, we learn behaviors in a very top-down way, right? We can make adjustments. We can say, oh, that wasn't effective, right? We have this metacognition, this ability to think about thinking and to think about our actions and our solutions. And we can say, oh, that didn't work. I need to try something different. That takes a really high level of frontal lobe function, right? Our executive function skills have to be fully developed, really well developed. And our emotional regulation needs to be really, really good to be able to analyze situations objectively and then to choose to do something different. For us to expect a 4-year-old to be able to do that is developmentally inappropriate. I'm just going to say that. You need to know that that's just not appropriate. Nothing drives me crazier than when I hear an adult say to a 4-year-old, sometimes a 3-year-old, you need to make a better choice. And I just sort of laugh inside because I think at my age, as a grandparent, I'm still struggling with making the right choices. So, and my frontal lobes are supposedly fully developed at my age. And I'll take a moment here to tell you that your frontal lobes, that executive function skill, does not fully develop until you're in your 30s or 40s. So you got to cut our kids a little bit of slack. The good news here is that we do not only learn maladaptive behaviors, we learn good behaviors, we learn adaptive coping skills, and we are all capable of learning adaptive skills. It's our job as the adults to help children learn those adaptive skills, right? To guide them so that they do learn the skills that are more effective. All right, so those are factors that influence behavioral responses. Now, when we talk about challenging behaviors, what I often hear from parents is that these behaviors are because the child is seeking attention. They just want attention, even if it's negative attention. I don't even know what negative attention is, but well, I guess it's when you get yelled at, right? Somebody's angry back at you. I don't know about you, but I don't like negative attention. And I'm going to tell you, there's no kid on this planet that wants negative attention. No kid wants to be yelled at. I like to look at it as connection, right? Maybe they're, quote, being bad, but that's because that's all they know. And when they're bad, when they act this way, they might not even think it's bad. They just know that when they act this way, there's somebody there to interact with. And as human beings, that's what we really want. We want connection. We want engagement, right? Other times, parents or other adults will say to me, they just want control. They just want to control this. Well, duh, we all want control. And if you're listening to this and you can tell me that you don't want control of your life and your behaviors and your actions, I think you're in denial because we all want control. And learning what we control and how to control ourselves and how to let go of control of the things we can't control, that's a developmental process. That's a learning curve. So again, let's cut our kids some slack. Another thing people often say when they're talking about behaviors is, oh, they just want to get out of that. They're just trying to avoid cleaning their room. They're trying to avoid, they don't want to eat this food. They're just misbehaving so that they can get out of something. Oh, and I love the one when we say, therapeutically, us professionals, many of my colleagues will say, well, they do not want to do non-preferred tasks. Again, I'm going to say, duh, I don't want to do non-preferred tasks either. I mean, honestly, I will scrub my kitchen floor with a toothbrush before I want to sit down and type out an evaluation report. Typing reports, I love doing assessments. I love meeting children and their families and diving in and exploring and learning about them and developing a plan of care. What I hate is writing the report. And I will avoid that at all costs, right? Until the very last minute that I've got to get that thing done. It takes a lot of effort for me to force myself to sit down and type that report. It's a non-preferred task. And I'm sure you can think of some of your own non-preferred tasks. And you engage in behavior to avoid those non-preferred tasks. So again, let's cut our kids some slack. Another thing I hear a lot of is they just want to get their way, which is kind of the control thing, right? But it also speaks to just like this manipulation, right? This idea that they have, they don't have the ability to do give and take. It's got to be their way or the highway. So I'm going to say two things about this one. First of all, we all like things our way, right? Back to the control thing. Second of all, sometimes that is simply a sign of poorly developed flexibility. And flexibility is an executive function skill. So when kids are super rigid, I guess I'm going to say three things about this. Change my mind. It's about control that we all want. It's about lack of flexibility. And number three is that it is sometimes developmentally appropriate. Toddlers want their way. Toddlers it's just normal. Kids between the ages of 18 months and 3 years, they are going to want their way. They're going to, they're asserting their autonomy, right? They want to see how much control do they have. It's a way of testing. But again, it's developmentally appropriate at some times. And it's also developmentally appropriate if the child is there developmentally at that point in their development, even if they're not 18 months to 3 years of age. Maybe they're older, but they're just now expressing their autonomy. And the last thing I hear a lot from parents is things like, well, they're just being oppositional. They're just trying to be difficult. They're just being mean. They just like being mean. They like being oppositional. Well, I'm not sure that that's true. I don't think, generally speaking, that children enjoy being bad. They're not waking up in the morning trying to think of different ways to make other people miserable or to just be difficult. They truly don't know another way to behave, or they revert to that way of behaving when they are in a difficult situation. And when I say that, I mean a situation where they feel threatened or unsafe or anxious, frustrated, afraid, all kinds of emotional responses that trigger that oppositional behavior, that trigger the just being difficult or just being mean kinds of things. So now we've talked about typical ways we view behavior. I want to shift gears and I want to talk about a better way to look at behavior. So let's look at behavior from more of a developmental and what I'm going to call a humanistic approach. And with this in mind, we want to understand that first and foremost, our behaviors are driven by a need for safety. Our brain is designed as a well-tuned machine to keep us safe. It is going to do anything and everything it can to keep us safe from threats. That's why we have maladaptive defensive behaviors. It's why we have fight or flight, or fight, flight, freeze, and fawn are the 4 limbic system responses. So when we engage in behaviors, we are actively seeking avoidance of threats, avoidance of stress, pain, and fear. We're looking for emotional and physical safety. We're looking for human connection and co-regulation, right? We want to find somebody to help us feel safe, to know that this is okay, right? We call this co-regulation. Our brain wants us to be in a state of Zen, in our happy place. We want to be calm and organized. No brain wants to live in this heightened, trauma-based limbic system state. But the reality is, some of our children live in that heightened state. And then the last piece that our brain does is seek joy, right? We are actively seeking pleasure. We want satisfaction. We want rewards. We want positive feedback. Neurologically, it's that dopamine response. We are driven for that kind of behavior. As I've mentioned, developmentally, we need to consider typical skill development. We need to recognize that adaptive behavioral responses, meaning appropriate to the situation, right? Appropriate to the activity or the task, those things are learned through development. We have to learn how to share, learn how to take turns, learn how to inhibit our anger responses, learn what we control, what we don't control, learn how to shift our attention, right? You see the pattern? It's all learned. And we can't expect children to have all the skills to behave like an adult. It is just not developmentally appropriate. And then the other piece of development that I want to talk about is what's called asynchronous development. And this happens in the gifted population, where we see some areas of development really off the charts, well developed. Maybe all their developmental energy has gone into language development, and you have an early reader, or you have a child, again, that can do math well beyond the expectation for their age or grade level. But their motor skills might be lagging behind, or their social emotional skills, their coping skills, their executive function skills, right? And those gaps can be even wider when the child has a twice exceptional situation going on. So we want to look at behavior from this very brain-based and developmental approach, instead of this simplistic cause and effect oversimplification that drives us to always look at the behavior and how do we stop the behavior. That's not what this is about. The approach I want you to understand is that we change behavior by meeting the child's needs and teaching the skills that they require so they can do better. That's it. That's the key. I want to share a few examples. I'm going to share a few examples. So it's story time. Places where this really came home for me. And maybe some of these stories will resonate with you. Maybe they'll sound familiar with regards to the child that you're thinking of, the child that brought you to this podcast. The first story I want to tell you is about a little guy that I was treating in OT, and we were having a very difficult time with transitions. It's always a compliment when children do not want to leave an OT session. Highest compliment I can ever get. This little guy was really struggling, and he was like 6 years old. And so at the age of 6, you would expect this child to be able to understand, our time is done, it's time to go home. And he would engage in avoidance. He would engage in aggression. He would yell and scream and cry. He'd run away. He just wasn't going to leave. So I started setting our visual timer. We love the time timer. You can search and find that if you're looking for a visual timer for home use. And in one session, I turned my back on him to reach up and set the timer. And as I did that, I said, I'm going to set the timer so we know when it's time to say goodbye. And before I could turn around, I was hit right between my shoulder blades with a beanbag. Just thump really hard. That little guy he threw that beanbag with all his might, and it hit me right in the middle of the back. And I heard his mom, who was in the room at the time, she was in the session with us. I heard her audibly gasp at what her child had just done. And I put my hand out to indicate for her to just be quiet for a moment. And I had to pause. I was at the beginning stage of learning how to respond differently to these kinds of behaviors. And so I paused, trying to think of like, okay, what do I want to do here? And what I had been learning was be curious, don't react, just be curious about where this behavior came from. So that's what I did. And I asked him, I turned around and said, oh, did you want me for something? Did you need me? And he looked at me and he growled. Arr! And he picked up another beanbag. And I said, oh, you are angry. So I labeled what I saw as an emotion. And then he growled, I hate that timer. Now, I'm still trying in my brain to figure out how am I going to manage this aggression, this aggressive behavior. But what I had read was buy some time. Say that right back to the child. So I did. I said, oh, I hate that timer too. What's up with that timer? And then I paused to see what he was going to do next. And in that pause, he gave me this golden nugget. He said, I'm not done playing. Aha. That was the reason for the beanbag hitting my back. He was upset at leaving, at the idea that we were going to be finished. Now I can address that, right? Now I know that's why he threw it. So I said, oh, I'm not done playing either. Look, we still have this much red on the timer. We have time to play. I said, do you want to play until the timer is done? I want to play. I'm leaning into him. I'm connecting. I'm embracing his idea. And he said, yes. And all the aggression was gone. And we were able to play. And when the timer went off, he wasn't angry. He expressed sadness. So I used the tools I was learning and I connected to his sadness. And I said, oh, buddy, I know it's really sad to be finished. I wish we could stay all day. The problem is our time is done. And I think you need to go home and eat lunch. Well, the minute I said lunch, I got super lucky. He said, oh, McDonald's. So that was very fortunate. It doesn't always happen that easily. But he latched onto that. And my language was comforting and not intimidating. It wasn't scolding, right? It was trying to connect to him, trying to understand where he was coming from. And he was a highly verbal child. He could have said something to me instead of throwing the beanbag. But here's what I want you to know. After that, using the timer went much better. And he never threw a beanbag at me again. I didn't have to reprimand him. I didn't have to scold him. I just needed to address his frustration, his anger, his sadness, at having to finish playing. So maybe that sounds familiar to some of you. Another one I want to tell you about is something that happens quite frequently when we have parents who say to us that their children won't get ready in the morning, right? That their child just throws a fit and has a huge meltdown. All they do is say, "Go get dressed. It's just time to get dressed." And their kid just pitches a fit and is rolling on the floor and is refusing to get dressed. And I do an assessment and I find out that they have some motor challenges. And when you ask them to put their shoes on, they sit on the floor and they pull their foot up and they lean forward and they grab their shoe and they pull their foot up off the floor to put their foot inside the shoe, and they lose their balance and they fall over. And sometimes those children, they throw that shoe in anger, and again, they get frustrated and mad and they refuse. And eventually, right now they've learned that they can't get their shoes on without falling over, which is so frustrating. And maybe they're 4, 5, 6, maybe they're 8 or 10, and they still can't put their shoes on. It doesn't matter how old they are. They are repeatedly frustrated that they can't do this independently and that they need help. And perhaps there's this culture in the house and expectation in the house, in the family, that because of the child's age and because sometimes they do it independently, they should always be able to do it independently. Well, over time, that child who has had repeated failures at not being able to get dressed, that child is going to just start getting angry the minute you say that it's time to get dressed. The trigger has now become the request to get dressed. It's not the actual task of putting the shoe on. It's just the fact that I've got to think about having to put my shoes on. I've seen other situations where children get very stressed about the fact that getting dressed means they're going to school, and school is the stressful situation. So they actually get stressed and anxious, and all of a sudden their clothes itch like crazy and bother them. They can't put their socks on, and they're having these meltdowns and they're crying and so sad. And it's actually got nothing to do with the socks. The socks might bother them more, but it's because their anxiety about school has increased their sensory sensitivities. And now they're caught on this hamster wheel. They're caught on this cycle that they can't break, right? They're on this merry-go-round that's going faster and faster of anxiety and sensory sensitivities. And they need us to co-regulate with them and bring them down. Okay, so maybe some of those examples are similar to things that you're experiencing in your life. So what I want to suggest, what I'm going to tell you, is that we need to develop a new understanding of behaviors that leads to a better way to address these behaviors. So the first thing we're going to do is really work hard to build our skills for understanding typical development and our child's unique development. We want to understand neurodiversity. We want to understand the challenges that our child is facing and how that plays out in terms of skills that they need to learn. And we want to keep our expectations in alignment with the child's abilities and challenges and in context, right? So again, a child who can't sit still, well, not sitting still at the park is okay. They don't have to sit still at the park. But we need to problem solve practical, real life strategies that are going to work to help them sit still at their religious service or in the library or at school, right? And we want to make sure that our knowledge of the child and our understanding of development changes as the child grows and learns new skills, because our job is to scaffold those skills for independence. So again, we'll talk about this on another podcast. I can do multiple podcasts on scaffolding, but that's just the strategy of providing the right amount of support so the child can be successful, and then backing that support off as the child builds skills so that they get a sense of independence and autonomy, which again is developmentally appropriate, right? So quick example would be that child who doesn't have the motor skills to put their shoes on. Put them in a corner, in a what I call build a nest, right? Maybe it's a big beanbag chair where they get full support of their body. Now they won't fall over, right? Have them sit in the corner of the couch or in a nice supportive armchair where they can pull their foot up and get their shoe on without falling over. Maybe it means you, as the parent, physically helping them with their shoes. You help with one, they do the other one. And there's lots of different ways to scaffold that so that the child starts to have success and starts to feel a sense of competence and mastery, which is a developmental level. And we want to encourage and support that. The second thing we want to do is to recognize that behaviors are a reflection of an internal state. It's our emotional regulation, right? It's our nervous system regulation and our needs. What do we need right now? If we are well regulated going into a situation, we're more likely to be able to handle it well. If we are dysregulated going into the task, forget it. That task is going to be difficult no matter what. So always remember regulation first. Remember that kids co-regulate with us as adults. Actually, we all co-regulate with each other. Even you, as an adult, you're looking for other adults to co-regulate with. And we want to focus on proactive strategies for that regulation. I get a lot of questions about what to do in the middle of a meltdown. And I'm going to tell you, all you can do is hold on. You have to keep the child safe, and you're just containing the behaviors. I see no point in focusing on how to manage a meltdown. I'll help you. I'll give you some strategies. We'll talk about that, in the future. But my goal is to teach you how to problem solve proactively, be prepared, and avoid those meltdowns, avoid those, 5 out of 5 outbursts, because that's not where the magic happens. The magic happens when we're regulated and we can learn the skills that eliminate those outbursts. All right, the third thing I want you to do is to appreciate the context surrounding a behavior. That is the relationships. Is the child with someone they trust and that they can co-regulate? Do they feel safe? Is the environment safe for the child? Is it, from a sensory perspective, overwhelming? Is it just too stimulating for the child? Again, are they regulated coming into it? Are they able to stay regulated going through the situation, or the task? Those are things that we're going to explore moving forward. And then we're going to focus on the strengths and skills of the individual. We're going to look at this child. We are going to get to know this child really, really well. I want to help you learn about your child to a depth that you didn't think was possible. I want you to know what are all of their strengths. Sometimes parents can't name their child's strengths, and your child absolutely has strengths. And they also have challenges, right? Whether those are developmentally appropriate challenges or whether they are challenges due to neurodevelopmental conditions and different things going on for them. But we're going to focus on those strengths because strengths are the foundation for successful strategies. So, for example, if you have a child that is very visually oriented, you can do something as simple as bringing out 2 physical snacks from the cabinet to say, do you want the apple or the fruit snacks? Because without the physical apple and the physical bag of fruit snacks, your child might not be able to process the language when you say, do you want apple or fruit snacks? So add the visuals. And there's many, many different simple strategies we can use. Encourage strong-willed kids to help you solve a problem. Strong will is a strength. I didn't used to see it that way, but it absolutely is a strength of an individual, right? I sometimes laugh and say, these are the CEOs of the future. I myself might be a little strong-willed. So, and maybe you are, maybe you know that you're strong-willed and you see that strong will in your kids as well. The apple doesn't usually fall far from the tree, as we say. So strong-willed kids love to solve problems. They are very independent. They are very resilient and persistent. So solicit their help, right? Hey, I have a problem here. Somebody left their shoes blocking the doorway. I think somebody might trip. This is a big problem. I'm going to tell you, that strong-willed kid, more often than not, will jump up and say, oh, I can fix that, and move their shoes. It's a miracle sometimes to see them react that way, but it works. Not 100% of the time, but it's worth a try. And then we love to incorporate their passions, their interests, their obsessions. So anything that your kid is all over, whatever it is of the moment, go ahead and use it. I had a little guy that I worked with a while back who was totally into construction, and he loved to do pretend play that he was on the construction job and he was a construction worker. And one of the concerns was that he wasn't following directions, and he would go into the kitchen and grab food and eat a whole box of snacks when he wasn't supposed to. And so we set up a system that their home was like a construction site, and mom was the foreman, right? Mom and dad are the supervisors, and he's the worker, and he needs to check with the foreman before he does that. And then we would set up tasks that were structured like a construction job, right? And that he would play the role of the worker. And then sometimes he would get to be the foreman, because this is a way for him to learn about giving and receiving directions. So we worked on all kinds of great skills, incorporating that theme of construction work into his learning. And then the last piece of this approach is that we problem solve. We problem solve for unique solutions for you and your child that focus on skill development that will influence the behavior instead of working on controlling a behavior, right? We see patterns of behaviors, but I think each situation should be looked at as unique and potentially needing a new solution. And the reason for this is because some children might have what I call a go-to behavior. So for example, we might have one child who routinely, in response to all kinds of things, throws themselves to the floor, screams and cries and thrashes all over the place. And that's just their go-to response. Anytime they're frustrated, right? Whether you say no to them, whether they're told they got to come to the table for dinner, or that they have to go to the bathroom, it's time for a potty break. They got to get dressed, they got to go to bed. It doesn't matter, right? They might have that same behavior 6 times in one day, and it was for 6 different reasons. So this is another example of why trying to address the behavior of crying, screaming, throwing yourself to the floor, that's not helpful if you don't know why they're doing it in that particular situation. So I will tell you, I have found that addressing the underlying cause, right, that is so much more effective than focusing on just making the behavior stop. We need to focus on what we can control. And what we can control is what we teach our children. What we can control is how we react to the behavior. And our goal is to eliminate the challenging behavior through teaching skills and supporting successful participation of our kids. So, to summarize, the key takeaways from today that I want you to remember are: behavior is complex, very complex. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. There is no secret magic key that's going to fix it all. It's going to take effort and time, and it takes practice to learn how to problem solve, right? Because challenging behavior, takeaway number 2, challenging behavior in kids is influenced by a wide array of factors, including their skill level, their emotional capacities, and their nervous system regulation, just to name a few, right? Takeaway number 3, viewing behaviors in a simplistic and negative light is just not helpful, right? Oversimplifying it, right? Cause and effect kind of thinking, and thinking that the child is doing it out of some sort of maliciousness or misbehavior, just being bad, trying to control, manipulate, those kinds of perspectives, they're just not helpful. They're not conducive to seeing your child's strengths and supporting your child's success. And then takeaway number 4, understanding and changing behaviors requires truly understanding the child, their strengths, their challenges, and their needs, while learning to proactively address those needs and teach those skills instead of trying to control the behavior. So, if this approach to behavior is new to you, or you're really working right now to wrap your head around how this could possibly help you and your child, drop me a note and let's chat. You can email me directly. My email address is Debra, Debra, at stepsfordevelopment.com. And I would be happy to set up a time to connect with you and explore this on a one-to-one basis. You can also follow me on social media. I'm at Steps for Development on Facebook or Instagram, and you can shoot me a DM through social media if you would like. And do be sure to tune back in here for more episodes about behaviors and development and just parenting support as we take steps together to support the kids that we love and care for. So thanks for joining me today, and bye for now.